Welcome to the Lisa Show Book Club. I'm really excited to have Gina James here, who happens to be my little sister, but is
Hello.
also intelligent, and we're really glad to have you here.
I know how to read, so I'm happy to be here.
I know, totally. And we are diving into part 5 of our book club on Alone Together by Sherry Turkle. And we are covering chapters 10 and 11. And if you haven't had a chance to go back, you should for chapters and sections 1 through 4. And so in these chapters, in 10 and 11, I mean, it starts off just with like how everyone hates the phone now. Do you answer the phone?
I do. I'm probably one
Do
of
you
those
like
rare
talking
people.
on the phone?
It depends. And I think to the point of the book, it's kind of situational. It depends on
Yeah.
who you're talking to, what you're talking about, and if you feel like you have time to give, to the person on the other end of the line.
What I think is really important about this book in Alone Together is that when she's laying out, this is just how we use technology. This is kind of how we thought we would use it. And then this is actually how we've ended up using it. And we have pointed out in other sections that this was published or reprinted in 2017, which, after a few years, so much more has changed. And I think that this chapter of no need to call, which is really not only what this section is called, but also why people hate the telephone and how, especially younger people, it doesn't matter if you're male, female, any gender, nobody likes it. Like it's just sort of like everyone's just decided that it's too much intimacy. And I thought it was really interesting that in previous chapters, we talked about this idea of how technology, instead of serving us, is kind of redefining how our relationships with other people. And I think it's most dramatically shown in the phone, where, I mean, think about it, generations past, you would have died to be able to talk to your family across the ocean. You would have given anything to stay in touch with somebody this easy. And now it's looked on as an annoyance. We got there really fast.
We did. It's really interesting because I think back to when texting was like kind of forced onto me.
Yeah, same.
I was a young mom. I was home with my kids, and my husband was working, and he had, a cell phone. And he's like, it would just be so much easier if I could just text you things really quickly rather than having to call you and say, hey, what's going on tonight, or what needs to be picked up, from the store on my way home or whatever.
On Tuesday night.
Exactly. Yeah. And so much has changed because as soon as I got the hang of it and was doing, texting on my flip phone, I did find myself making a lot fewer phone calls and coordinating. And, I do use text a lot more than just picking up the phone to call someone.
It's really interesting, like hearing about history and having a story that, I was there when.
Oh, remember in 7th
switched.
grade? Well, so I think directly back to when I was in junior high and compare it to my son right now.
Okay.
So my son's in junior high, and with his permission, I can share the information I have collected from him regarding this topic. So when I was, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, you would spend hours on the phone.
Oh, hours.
Hours. And we had one of those cords that were extra, extra long. So you could take it from where the phone is and walk to kind of the edge of the room or go sit on the stairs or kind of move around while you're talking to your friends.
Yeah.
And then your sisters or brothers would say, hey, get off the phone. I want to
call
do the
waiting,
same thing.
beeping.
Yeah, or call
it's my
waiting.
Friend. I don't care. Yeah.
And so looking now, he will text his friends a lot.
Okay.
He'll communicate with his friends while he's playing video games. But it was interesting. I asked him about speaking on the phone. And he's like, I don't really mind it. He goes, but I never make phone calls. Yeah. It's FaceTime. So if the kids are talking on the phone, they're like FaceTiming. So it's kind of a phone call, but kind of not, because he said, I usually am doing other things too.
So you never get anybody's full attention.
Just like she's talking about in this. Kids don't want to necessarily give full attention because it requires too much.
Yeah,
it's
but
too
and we
hard
say
to
kids.
Think, well, kids, yeah.
But also us.
Right. But it's just that single-mindedness that, we're not able to focus that way. He's like, it gets too boring if I'm on the phone and not doing something else.
I remember talking to my boyfriend in high school for 4 hours one night.
Oh, easily.
And when I think about that now, I think, what did we talk about? Which makes me sad because I don't remember. And also, I don't think I could talk to anyone for 4 hours on the phone that I had just seen the day before.
Well, and that's to the point of like kids today.
And you weren't doing something else.
But you weren't doing anything else. But you also didn't know what they were doing throughout the day,
that's
like the
true.
kids do now on Snapchat.
And not just kids, though. It's us, too.
I know, but I don't Snapchat my friends what I eat for breakfast and send them random pictures of the
that is true.
ceiling.
You don't do
I
that.
don't send them pictures of me like as a passenger in a car at school lunch. Or
right.
I mean, have you seen some of the dumb pictures? I'm like, why is this
No,
meaningful?
all my
Why is
kids,
this interesting?
and you know my kids because you're their
Yes.
aunt. A couple of my kids, all they post is dumb stuff, like things that they think are really dumb, not things that I just think are dumb. Like they only send dumb memes or pictures that I don't understand. They don't send what I would call vulnerable or authentic communication, which is different. And I think it's changing the relationships because it's just all done for comedy or for a perception.
Well, and it just keeps it top level, right?
Yeah.
And so I asked a couple of my children. So I have a 17-year-old daughter and a 19-year-old daughter, and I asked them, so in what ways, like if you want to have a serious conversation with someone,
Yeah.
what do you do?
Oh, good question.
You know, and one of them was like, well, I would talk to them in person,
Yeah.
which is interesting because I think that there's also a lot of reticence to do that. I mean, like if you're
Oh,
really
yeah.
honest with yourself, just like she points out in this book in chapter 10, you know, people don't want that vulnerability because they can't instantly decide how they're going to react.
No, it's uncomfortable.
I thought there was
It's weird.
there's a really interesting story where there was a girl who found out that I think it was a friend, and then there was another example of the friend's father that died
Yes.
over social media and then over just like an Instagram or something, or an instant message. And I thought that's really interesting because then they have time to process and react. But then I think,
But then the
why
friend-
wouldn't you want to have that reaction?
But the friend, bumped into her and said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And she's like, "Well, I'm not going to call you. Like, I have something to tell you."
Right.
And then it's kind of easier that way.
Yeah. So it's like that hierarchy of what's more intimate in person on the phone.
Yes.
But I think the point is, no, just the connection, just letting them know. Like, I think that's one
Okay.
big thing. I think it shows your closeness of relationships if you will directly go someone to tell them your news, whatever news that is.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Well, and Sherry says face-to-face conversations happen way less. I mean, friendships get broken. You ask people out on text, not face-to-face. You break up with people online. And some people think, oh, I'm more like me online. I can like craft it a little bit better than if I'm
Is
just.
that you?
I don't know. That's
Is
the
that
question.
you?
And I thought that was such an interesting question. People you're never going to speak to. Audrey, she did talked about how she's got, this was a case study that Sherry writes about how she's got her camera and her phone with her all day. She's constantly shaping her avatar, like she's in it, but she's saying people you're never going to speak to is what her focus is. And Erik Erikson and Sherry Turkle really quotes him a lot as a philosopher and as a psychiatrist, like about thoughts about what do adolescents need for their development? Like how do you really like create your sense of self? And you need this kind of consequence-free identity play, when you're just like kind of
Yeah.
trying on different, like, am I like this? Am I like that? You're just trying it out when you're an adolescent because you don't really know who you are. You're discovering it and you're choosing it a little bit. So when identity is multiple in this way, people feel whole, not because they are one, but because the relationship among aspects of self are fluid and undefensive. We feel ourselves if we can move easily among all of our different aspects of self.
But I think that's a challenge in this world even more because
Yeah.
we could do that interplay in junior high and
Yeah.
because, by
Well, and you can fake
when you're at school or when you're at the mall, but there was no record of any of that. And
Yep.
so there was no one
Yes.
who was going to be able to see, oh, you're a totally different
Yes.
person, on the weekends, or you're acting crazy over at this friend's house where you feel safe and comfortable. Whereas when you're at school, you're just really straight-laced or something. I mean, not speaking from personal experience or anything.
No, of course not.
But today's kids don't have that because it's always recorded. Everything's recorded. So then they've
It's
taken
changing
that.
their identity.
It is. It's changing how they present themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
And then that breaks my heart because I think to some extent there's more conformity, even though
Yeah.
they say, no, I'm more myself. I'm like,
I know what you're saying.
it's
And
just-
I
I
think
think
that
it's the
it's
opposite.
happening to adults as well. I just think it
Definitely.
happens slower with us because we've already had experience not having it. But those who've never had any experience not being immersed in this kind of technology have no other point of view.
yeah.
So
yeah.
I do think that it influences us. I just think it's at a slower rate. And
Yeah, no, I don't doubt that there's influence on us. It's interesting that you talk about dating. So I asked my 19-year-old daughter who
yeah.
dates a bit, and I said, how does how you're contacted influence you? And she said, it's really interesting. She said, there's a hierarchy. She's like, if somebody
Oh my
snaps me
gosh.
and asks me out, like on Snapchat, she's like, nah, I don't really take it super seriously. You don't know me. Like,
disappears,
She said,
whatever.
a text is a little bit more commitment. She goes, but if somebody calls me on the phone and asks me out in person, like on the phone, like
Yeah.
has taken the time to get my phone number, not just like my Snapchat handle from somebody else or something. She said, then I know that they're actually serious and that this is going to be
That does
like a
seem
serious fun date. Isn't that interesting?
It's so interesting.
And it's unwritten because I asked my other children, I
Yeah.
said, what's the hierarchy? Snapchat is like casual, fun, just quick conversations. Even like a text message, is a little bit more formal. My 14-year-old said, he's like, that's kind of formal if you text somebody. And I'm thinking to
I'm
myself,
blown away by
that
that.
is not formal. That's like for me in my generation, I'm like, that's an informal.
Yeah.
It's super convenient. It's quick. Yeah. But it's interesting because the opposite, and don't even ask them about email. Like nobody uses email.
I
to
said
contact
to
each
my daughter,
other.
Margaret, I was like, oh, I sent you this email of this like camp that you might like. And all that. She goes, oh, well, I'll see it in about 2 years. And I said, what do you mean? Don't you ever check your email? And she was like, oh, no one does.
Even with I have a organization that I work with, and when I email them, it's so funny. I'll send a group text saying I sent you an email because I can't put all the information I need to send you in a text, but I text to say go check your email because it is an
wow.
important medium still. Anyway, but that hierarchy of Snapchatting or like a TikTok video or something versus a text or a phone call is real. And just to Sherry's point, that hasn't changed. Like but it's interesting because it seems like the less formal it is, the more upset people are if there's no response. Because I asked my son, I said, well, what happens if somebody doesn't Snapchat you? And he said, well, I get really mad if they don't Snapchat me back. He goes, because I can see if they've read it.
Oh, you can see when they're online.
I can see, he goes, I can see if they've read other people's. And he says, but it's so easy to respond. Because it's so easy, if they don't, that's hurtful when there's no response.
That's so
there.
true, though.
And I'm like, that's amazing.
And how quickly we got used to it. If I
Yeah.
called somebody, it was reasonable that you would wait like 2 or 3 days for them to call you
Yeah.
back.
I mean-
but now for like a text, if somebody doesn't immediately text me, I think, oh, are they mad at me?
Yeah.
And I think, no, Lisa, like people are busy. Like, what are you talking about?
That-
Like, why are you?
That's so
but,
funny.
But we
Yeah.
are used to, the technology is changing our brains in that we are used to instantaneous communication. We feel the right to be able to get in contact with anybody at every time. And that is changing our relationships. And something that I do appreciate about this book is, yes, there's lots of different case studies where it's like, hey, I followed this person. I asked this person. I asked different ages, different experiences about a response to robots and technology, which is, a form of technology, but it changes for everybody. I thought it was interesting that she said anthropologist Victor Turner writes that we are most free to explore identity in places outside our normal life routines, places that are in some way betwixt and between. Turner calls them liminal from the Latin word threshold. They are literally on the boundary of things. And that made me think about technology and the way that we look at our life online in a different way of not necessarily, because I don't like to villainize technology. We create it to serve us. But if we're using it in the wrong way, then we can change it. We can use it in a different way. But I had never stopped to consider where I live. Like I always think, oh, my life online is like this. My life in real life is this. My real life is more important, right? And I think, oh, I've got it solved. But what about the sort of in between, places as you are redefining ourselves. We talk about identity with adolescents as if they're the only ones that ever do that, but we all go through changes in our lives and kind of pretend like we don't sometimes, like that we're always supposed to stay our authentic, true selves. And I'm like, these things are changing the way that we see each other, so we should look at them in a different way. Does that make sense?
I totally get that. Well, and I liked her point how some people in trying to figure that out will say, will draw a hard line
Yes.
between their between their IRL life, in real life, I guess, their day-to-day interactions, and then their internet life. And it was interesting to me, this group of teens that were like, oh, we don't talk about stuff that happens online in person.
That would be a betrayal.
Yeah.
I was like, that was weird to me.
That
to
was
hear.
weird because you're the same person. Because my
easier for
belief is
them.
you
Yeah.
should be the same person. But reading this book really made me think, or really made me recognize that some people don't see it that way. They feel like they can live a completely different life online than they do in what do you call it? In person, in real life.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and you kind of see that a little bit, I think, with people whose business is based online.
Oh, yeah.
I just read a recent article about influencers and how they don't get kind of the dues in the business world when if you looked at them, and especially here where we are in Utah, there's a ton of like mom influencers, just because I think, with our families and things like that, and that they're not getting their dues as business women, as business people, for building these huge empires on, and the product is their lives and their online life and how that influences. And that's so interesting to me, because if you think about it that way, then you're like, yes, they need that. They need the acknowledgement that they're really savvy businesswomen. But on the other hand, you go, well, but what's their private life like? It's like, how is that now their online life influencing what they do in their private life?
Yeah, kind of
because
the
a lot
observer
it's
effect.
it's so wrapped up together. And so in her bringing that up in this book, it was just so interesting because of the fact that, some people do draw that hard line while others, it's so blurred, it becomes their
Yeah.
business.
Okay, so I love how she uses Adam as an example. He's disappointed in himself, right? And so he goes online. This simulation makes him feel like a success, right? Makes him feel like he's got all of this success. The games make him feel like he's living a better life. And this is the sweet spot of simulation, Sherry says, the exhilaration of creativity without the pressure. Right? Like I'm
Yeah.
free to like make and create these things. And it doesn't seem like the consequences for either like the tension between creating something and putting it out there is as tense as it is in real life. And the excitement of exploration without risks. And so Adam plays on, escaping to a place where he does not have to think beyond the game. But Adam's afraid he's going to lose his job.
I know, but
He hasn't been writing songs. He didn't write that screenplay. Do you know what I mean? So he didn't create something in that real world. And he hasn't finished his resume. He hasn't filed his taxes. These things, even just doing one of those things feels completely overwhelming. So what does he do? He goes back to the glow of the game, right? The simulation, as if you are creating, but he's creating something, but it has no tangible, permanence, right?
Yeah.
But yet it kind of does in one sense. And so it makes me think, as technology moves forward, if we will blur the lines, if we want to, if we choose, between what we consider real creative work.
So this is where I think in one example of, I think this book has great research, great history, and such a, because her research has gone on since I think the 70s is when it started.
She's in the forefront.
But in the last 5 years,
Yeah.
the whole Adam problem with that he's so involved in his games and his creating. So again, 14-year-old boy in my house, I know all about the gamers on YouTube.
Yes.
And in particular, the Minecraft creators, that video doing exactly what Adam's doing, creating these elaborate worlds, having challenges, recording that, putting it on YouTube, and then having millions of subscribers and then making a tangible in real life living from it.
Yeah.
And I think that leap shows that we're taking those people that have that rich online life and they've found a way to kind of break it through and make that authentic to their real life. And I think
Okay,
that's
that's an
fascinating
interesting way to
because
put it.
that's the bridge, right? That's how technology is changing us because they're not changing what they're doing, but they're opening it so that other people can see it so they can monetize it with advertisements through YouTube. It gets so complex.
I
with
remember
that.
years and years ago when I was telling my two oldest, I don't want you to be like living online, more than playing these online games, these video games, as much in real life. Like, so I severely limited, their time and things like that and think, okay, I've solved it. And I remember my oldest, Miles, so because you know him, you know that this is him at 12 going, yeah, but why is it more virtuous to play a board game than a video game? Why does the technology make it less valuable? He's like, if we were sitting around playing Monopoly all afternoon, you would think that was the cutest thing.
Yeah, but here's the
He's
thing.
right.
Yeah, but here's
by
the
the
thing.
way.
Nobody's going to play Monopoly all afternoon because it doesn't have the stimulation that those online games do.
Perhaps.
It doesn't have, plus it's really boring. And he's going to be playing with his brothers and sisters.
His point, though,
I know.
was whether it's online, you're just a Luddite, right?
Right.
It's kind of calling me out. And it did give me pause and say, okay, so let me tell you my real fears of becoming kind of like Adam and not having a job. And he's like, oh yeah, you don't want me to live in your basement and have no job. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want that happening. He's like, oh, okay, well then that's fair. Let's have that conversation. And so it is interesting to see what will happen 5-10 years because back then, and this was maybe 15 years or so, almost.
Yeah.
There weren't YouTubers making millions of dollars on it, but there are now, which only strengthens his point and weakens mine.
Exactly.
Which there's not Monopoly players making millions of dollars for YouTube subscribers. There just isn't.
No, and I think
unless there is, and then I apologize publicly.
Well, there's poker.
Yep.
So
yeah.
I'm like, so there's games.
But it's all online.
I mean, but they talk about the gaming too, and it's the same thing. But I don't know that there's that level of. I just think the internet has opened up the level of creativity and influence that you can have on the games and pieces because it's so interactive.
Yeah.
It's so responsive, which is really cool. Again, I'm with you. I don't attack the technology
for a need.
But how it affects people can be problematic.
Yeah, I love this. Our neurochemical response to every ping and ringtone seems to be the one elicited by the seeking drive, a deep motivation of the human psyche. Connectivity becomes a craving. Yeah, and that's different.
Yeah, totally. Well, and my favorite thing too about just that connectivity, it says there was a time when only physicians had beepers. Yeah. A burden, quote unquote, a burden shared in rotation. Now we've all taken up the burden, reframed as an asset or as just the way it is. It's like, no, that's just the way it is. And so it's interesting because I do have to struggle to put some limits on my connectivity.
Yeah.
To say, okay,
That's
no,
fair.
I'm only answering work calls when it's important. I'm only engaging online, especially with social media. I mean, to her point in the book where she's like, you look up and it's 3 hours later and you're like, what? And I think it's worse even than when this was originally, revised in 2017. And so there are some things we have to do to make sure that we do according to how we want to stay rooted in real life while remaining connected online.
Right. When we're looking for connectivity and then we end up being lonelier after 3 hours of scrolling, what does that teach us?
Yeah.
And maybe we should be just a little bit more mindful of it.
Yeah.
I know it's made me change my mind about a couple of things.
For sure.
And time on that. Thank you for this great discussion, Gina.
You're welcome.
This has been really fun, and we are really excited that you have joined us for the Lisa Show Book Club, where we have been looking into Section 5, chapters 10 and 11. We've really enjoyed Gina James and her perspective today. And I hope you'll join us next week for section 6. We're getting to kind of near the end of our book club. In part 6, we're going to be looking at chapters 12 and 13 and really looking at confessions that people share online and how technology and the internet gives an anonymity to these kinds of things, or does it? So I hope you'll join us next week.